Thank you again for joining me for the Author Stories podcast. I am author Hank Garner, your host, and welcome to the show where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. My guest today is Louisa Locke, or M. Louisa Locke, and I'm very happy to have her on the show today. She has a very unique niche in her writing that I find fascinating, and she's got a very exciting new project that she's going to tell us about too. Welcome to the show, Louisa.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm excited.
I ask all of my guests when we begin to give us a little history about you, how you became a writer. Was there a particular catalyst that got you into taking the stories that a lot of us have in our heads and putting them on paper and deciding to share those with the world?
I think, like a lot of people, it started with me being a voracious reader. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was the only child, and I was pretty much of a sort of shy loner, and reading was my comfort. And I also discovered historical fiction fairly early as one of my favorites. And so by the time I was 12, I was announcing to people that I wanted to be an historical fiction writer. And I think that happens with a lot of us. And then as we become more mature, we begin to discover that, most people don't make a living with writing. I actually did my freshman and high school civics paper that you were supposed to do to explore occupations by interviewing a woman who was a historical fiction writer in Pittsburgh. And I think she was actually fairly discouraging, so that when I went off to college, I majored in history with the idea that I would go on and become a history professor. Now, this was the late 1960s, and there weren't a lot of female history professors, so that was a big enough obstacle to overcome. And I think I always thought of writing as something that I might do as a hobby or, a later career. But as you can see, there was an interest in it very early on. I got my doctorate in history at UCSD in San Diego, and it was during the work on my dissertation that I came up with the plot for my first historical mystery. The name of that is Maids of Misfortune, and that was all the way back in 1979. The book was not published until 2009, so
wow.
I'm one of those late bloomers in terms of it took a long time between concept and actual fruition of my dream. But I went on to have a career as a history professor. And I wrote the draft of the novel sort of in between teaching jobs in 1989, and actually was quite successful in getting an agent. But in 1989, there were very few historical mysteries, and I chose historical mysteries because I really enjoyed mysteries as my recreational reading. And there were a few historical mysteries that had come out. The Brother Cadfael series, a medieval mystery series that became quite popular. And also mysteries with amateur female protagonists were just in that time period. It's hard to believe there was a time when there weren't very many books with female protagonists, but there was a time. And while I got an agent, what I got feedback was that they felt that the book, which eventually became Maids of Misfortune, had a lot of potential, but they already had one historical mystery, and they were not sure there was a market for more.
Right, because if there's one, why do we need a second, right?
Right, exactly. And right at that time, I got my full-time job teaching at a community college in San Diego, Mesa Community College, which became my career, and I loved it and had a wonderful time at it. But in the back of my mind, it was always, well, when I get time or when I retire, I will pull this manuscript out, because my thought about what became the Victorian San Francisco mystery series is my dissertation was on working women of the far west at the end of the 19th century. So I had all of this information, and I had this, 400-page doctoral manuscript, which I knew even if I got published, maybe at maximum 50 graduate students would read. And so my thought had always been, I loved these working women that I had researched and read about, and I wanted more people to know what their lives were like. So I thought if I wrote a series of popular mysteries, each focusing on a particular female occupation that was prominent in the 19th century, I could sort of share my love of those real people from the past with people in the present. And that's really what I've been able to do with the mystery series. And so it took a long time, but that goal was reached. And I'm still reaching it because I'm starting the research on the next one.
Wow.
So is that enough background?
Yes, that's wonderful. So the idea of this first story was hatched in 1979.
Right.
You actually wrote it in 1989?
Right.
Am I following the chronology?
Yes. I wrote the draft and revised it over the years and then self-published it in 2009.
Now, in 2009, what was the self-publishing landscape like? What did you publish it as an ebook? Did you do a print on demand? What was? Let's see, that's 6 years ago. A lot's changed in that amount of time.
Yes, it's interesting because what happened is I semi-retired from teaching in 2009. And so, as a researcher, I started to research. And I had been in a writers group for 20 years with traditionally published authors. So I had watched their successes in the 1990s as mid-list authors, and I'd watched their careers crumble in the changes that were going on in traditional publishing in the early 2000s. So I knew that if I went the traditional route, that one, I might not have much success, and two, if I did, at most, I might get a $5,000 advance, and then I would probably not see my book in print for another, 2-3 years. And I was approaching 60, and part of me thought, I don't want to wait 3 years to find out if this particular book, which of course I've had the idea for 30 years, is going to be read by anybody. So I really did the research. I read Conrath's Newbie's Guide to Publishing, and he had just started self-publishing and, of course, shared his details, which made it clear that if you did a good job of self-publishing, you could sort of make that advance, that $5,000 advance through self-publishing. And I got one of the first how-to books by a woman named April Hamilton. And using that how-to book, I created a print on demand through CreateSpace, and I uploaded to Smashwords, and I uploaded to KDP. And the only money I spent was, I think, some money for a domain name for a website, because, of course, I was reading the how-to books, and they said I needed a website. And I paid $250 to a friend who had a design degree to design the cover, and she's designed all my covers, which I quite love. And
yeah, they're fantastic.
Published. Yeah, so it didn't cost me much, and I found I have a fairly tech-savvy husband, so he was able to help me, figure out when I ran into a bump about, how to format a header and a footer and things like that. But otherwise, I found it fairly easy.
That's wonderful, and I've done over 50 interviews for this podcast, and I'm just amazed at the technology and the time that we live in that has allowed so many people to go from dream to printed book and actually connecting with readers, which is what we all want to do.
Yes.
In such a robust way and it really speed up the process. Like you said, I know some other authors who have either began self-publishing and then sold a book to a publisher, and then their book just disappears for like a year or 2 years. And it's nuts, and nobody got into writing to have their book just languish out in the ether. We write so that people can read our work.
Yeah. In fact, I had a friend from my writers group who got a contract pretty much the same time I decided to self-publish. And while, of course, she got a lot more money up front, that book took almost 3 years to come to print. And I think there was hesitation on her part to write the second until she saw how the first one did. So she's just now completing the rough draft of her second book while in that time period, I've written 5 books, 4 of which have been published, and a group of short stories. So I didn't have to wait to find out whether or not readers liked my book, which encouraged me to start writing again right away. And I think that's also one of the benefits of self-publishing and doing it on that sort of faster track.
Yeah. Let's look at the first book, Maids of Misfortune. You said it's a historical mystery.
Yes.
What is it about the book that's really connecting with readers?
I think there's a couple things. One is it really does cross genres. It's historical fiction, and it's good historical fiction because, of course, that's my profession, and
right.
So that's my research. I know these people quite well, but it's also a mystery. And it's a good old-fashioned sort of cozy mystery, in that there's a small group of individuals. In the case of Maids Misfortune, my protagonist has an unusual occupation, but of course I know it wasn't that unusual for 19th century. She pretended to be a clairvoyant in order to give business and domestic advice. And if you looked at the San Francisco Chronicle for the late 1870s, early 1880s, which is when I write, the ads on the front page had about 15 to 20, mostly women, advertising themselves as fortune tellers or clairvoyants or spirit mediums, because what they were doing is giving health and domestic and business advice that they couldn't do as just women. People wouldn't take their advice as women, but they would take their advice if they thought it was through horoscopes or, communing with the spirits, etc. And so that became my protagonist. So it was a classic amateur sleuth, but the mystery itself was a locked door mystery, where somebody died, and it was determined that it was murder. And then the question becomes, since it happened in a locked room, does that mean that somebody who actually was in the house did it, or was there some way that somebody could get into that house? But Maids of Misfortune refers to the fact that this was the book where I was going to explore domestic service, which was the most prevalent job that particularly young single women held in that time period. So my protagonist, Annie Fuller, goes undercover as a domestic servant in that household in order to determine what happened.
Oh my gosh, I love the setup for that. That is amazing. While you're talking, I just went to your Amazon page and just sent the first book to my Kindle. I can't wait to read that. It sounds amazing. I'm a huge fan of historical fiction, and the thing that I'm always amazed by is how easily a really good historical work immerses me in the time and place. And it seems like that the author just did this effortlessly, because good writing does that. But I know from talking with you that years of research went into this. If someone wanted to get into historical fiction, what advice would you give them other than read an awful lot in the period? Is there anything else that helps you to immerse the reader into that period?
It's interesting because a lot of my friends who write historical fiction were not trained historians. And so I absolutely believe that this is something that anybody who really, really enjoys history and enjoys doing research can do. I think it's a lot easier now because of the internet. For example, a lot of the sort of primary sources, and it's really good to read primary sources to get the feel of the language and attitudes of the time period. And sometimes it's novels written in that period, or sometimes it's newspaper articles or diaries. But things that I used to have to travel to get or get through interlibrary loan, increasingly you can go on the internet and download them, often for free because they've been scanned, if they're older, not sort of public domain books, so they're not under copyright. I try and visit. I don't live in San Francisco. I've never lived in San Francisco, so I try and visit, sort of at least once for each book and walk from place to place. Now, the buildings have all changed because the part of of San Francisco that was residential and vibrant in 1880 mostly burned in the 1906 fire. So there's not a lot of buildings standing, but the terrain's still there, right? You can walk up and you can look at a vista and you can walk down a street and see that it's fairly steep. So I do that, but then I can also look at Google Street and travel along if there's some place that I didn't walk or I want to refresh my memory about just sort of what it feels like. Are you trudging up a hill or down? I have a lot of books that are fashion for that period or interior decorate, what the sort of furniture and interior decorations are. So I do a lot of that research, even though I know the basic stuff from 30 years ago, I do a lot of new research, so it's fresh. But then you need to sort of put it away. Because I think, while I know that the people who particularly like historical fiction enjoy the feeling, the little details of are you going up the street or, are there gas lights or, what would be the smell of polish or whatever. There's a degree to which it's really the character and plot development that I think are going to keep them coming back. And that's the balance of doing historical fiction with a mystery element and a romance element, is that those are really three different markets. I think it's why I've been successful, because I have, a broad cross genre, but it also means the person who wants to find out who done it sometimes can get impatient with the historical detail, and the person who really loves the historical detail wants more of that, and then of course the person who wants the romance wants more of the romance. So I've noticed that the negative reviews I get, and I do get some, although most of my reviews are quite positive, are often somebody who was a real mystery aficionado and got impatient with the romance or vice versa.
Right. I think a lot of people don't appreciate the amount of research that goes into crafting the proper scene and things like that. There's in one of the time travel books I wrote, there was hours and hours and hours of research done to be able to craft a short description that was believable. And I love that your books are cross genre, and I do understand that people come with an expectation that they're going to get this or that. But I would imagine you've gotten a lot of positive feedback for that cross genre storytelling, that you are able to stitch those things together, because life is cross genre. That we don't every day is not all gooey romance, and not every day is full of mystery either. Do you get feedback from readers who enjoy the way that you're merging those genres together?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, one of the things that I'm quite pleased about is at this point I have over 1,000 reviews on Maids of Misfortune, which is the one that's been out the longest, and
that's amazing.
A huge percentage of them are 4 and 5 star, and absolutely, I get a lot of positive, generally from people who start off by saying, "I really enjoy this period," and then the mystery kept me guessing, and now I want to find out what happens to the romance. So when I get a review that does those three things, it means I've done, for their satisfaction, all the three things I was trying to do.
Yeah. So Maids of Misfortune comes out, and you start to find an audience, and the self-publishing thing is working for you. How long then before the follow-up, Uneasy Spirits, comes out?
Okay, I'm not a fast writer, although I'm trying to get faster. So the first book, came out November, December 2009, and then Uneasy Spirits comes out in October of 2011, so 2 years. And then the next book, Bloody Lessons, which is about teachers, that was the occupation Bloody Lessons featured, came out 2 years later, September 2013. And then the most recent book, Deadly Proof, which is about women in the printing industry, came out in February, and that was actually only a year and a half, so I was getting faster. And a lot of that is because of the research that it takes to get ready to write. in terms of writing and also marketing. But for Maids of Misfortune, the first year it was out, 2010, self-publishing was just starting to take off. And I got $5,000. I was so happy at the end of that year I'd made what I would have made probably in an advance. And then in 2011, my income quadrupled.
Wow.
And I was making enough to retire completely and write full time. And the year after that, I made as much as I had been making when I was a full-time professor at a community college. So as you can see, it sped up after that first year.
Yeah, and that sets so many conventions on its ear that, we hear that you've got to be cranking out a story every month. You've got to constantly feed the beast. But you've proven that that's not necessarily the case. That there probably is some truth to that, but that's not the only model that works.
Right. I think part of it is my market is broad enough so that, if you're in a much smaller niche, then I think there is a degree to which at a certain point you saturate the market, and then, you need to feed that market with a new book. But Maids of Misfortune at this point, for example, I just did a BookBub promotion with it, and now it's free, it's perma-free at this point, so it's free. But I probably have had, besides sales of it, which are, maybe 100,000 sales, I've had probably 300,000 downloads of it. And it still did wonderfully in this last promotion. Wow. So, there's still other people who haven't heard of it. And I think that permits you to put a book out every year and a half or every 2 years and still be able to sell steadily that book, because there's always people who haven't heard of it.
That's incredible. What was that decision like for you to make that first book perma-free? Was that a hard decision to make?
It's interesting. No, it was time. I knew people, historical mystery authors who had been quite successful with perma-free, and but I also knew that if I was going to essentially, get rid of income from one of the books, I wanted to have at least 3 other books. So for me, it was always not if I was going to do it, it was going to be when I was going to do it. And so I went perma-free just as my 4th book in the series came out. But the other reason I did it was that I had been successful first until recently, I've been primarily exclusive with Amazon using their KDP Select contract, which, 3 months at a time. In order to have certain promotion tools, I agree to only have my books sold, my ebooks sold on Amazon. And I've been very successful first using free, the 5 free days. And then in 2014, I've been quite successful in using the Kindle Countdown 99-cent sales.
Right.
And they've been successful. But when Kindle Unlimited subscription service came out, the Kindle Countdown's effectiveness just plummeted. And so, besides the fact that I had the 4th book coming out, which I'd always said to myself that would be the first time I would contemplate perma-free, I had real strong motivation, which is my sales had dropped tremendously. And perma-free has worked very well for me in the first 6 months of using it. My income is back up to what it was last year, if not maybe greater than when I had been using Kindle Countdown. So it was a fairly easy decision. I've never hesitated with the idea of offering books free, whether it's through libraries or giveaways, because I really do. I guess I believe my books enough to know that if somebody reads the first one, they're going to want to read the rest. Now, that's not true for everybody, but enough of them that's true for. And frankly, as a reader, I spent most of my life until I was a full adult reading books for free in the library. So, while it's nice to be paid as an author, it's even nicer to be read.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of authors can relate to that. It's a little counterintuitive, but I think there's plenty of people that can attest that giving your work away builds goodwill with your reading audience for sure, but broadens your base for future works for sure. Have you gotten much traction on the other platforms since moving away from Amazon exclusivity?
Yes, I had gone off Amazon exclusivity twice before in the 5-year period, and had been very frustrated because I had sold very little on Apple, Kobo, and Nook, which were the 3 major ones, primarily because I had a terrible time getting my books in the right categories. In fact, I would find categories, and I remember with both Nook and Kobo, I wrote them and said, it's not showing up in this, perfect sort of U.S. cozy historical mystery category. And they literally said, well, it's because you've published independently with us. We don't offer those categories. So it was clear that they offered those categories only to traditional published authors. So that was very frustrating.
Yes.
So this time around, much more successful, but I know it's because of free. I don't think my books are being found because they're in the right categories. I think they're being found because the first book is free. And so, because people by this time who like free books know where to find them. They know how to find them on bookstores. So pretty much what I've seen is the sales that I've lost by not being in the Kindle Unlimited subscription service, meaning I've lost those potential borrows, I've made up for in sales on the other bookstores combined, right? It's not nearly, none of the bookstores are nearly as good for me in terms of selling as Amazon, but when you put them all together, they're making up for the loss of not having my books available to borrow.
Casting that wide net to...
Yes.
Right. And once again, those free books providing you entree to places and readers that you may not have otherwise.
Right.
Excellent. Let's talk about the writing and the creative process for a minute. You are... well, first off, you put out the 4th book in the Victorian San Francisco mystery series. Is that series done, or are there more stories coming from that series?
Oh, no, it's not done.
Okay.
There's a lot more female occupations I need to cover.
Of course there are.
In fact, I just was very excited. I got in the mail a book called When Ladies Go A-Thieving, Shoplifting in the Victorian Era, because the next book is going to be women who worked in department stores.
Oh, wow.
So I'm just starting to do the research in that. I will continue as long as I have occupations I want to explore and things I want to develop about, my main characters that I've developed. There's romantic arc, but there's some new young characters that I introduced in the last 2 books, and so they've got their own romantic character arc that I'm interested in developing. So, I'm not done.
Now, as the series unfolds, are you anchored in this time period, or are you moving forward?
Each book occurs about 3 or 4 months after the first one. So
Okay.
I started out in August in 1879, and the last book ended in August 1880. So I'm very slowly creeping forward.
Okay. So should I assume that even though each book focuses on a different character and a different profession, that there's an overarching meta-narrative?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, there's 2 main protagonists, Annie Fuller, who is the one who was the pretend clairvoyant, and a lawyer, Nate Dawson, who is the romantic interest who also helps her. And then there's various people because she also runs a boarding house. In fact, becoming a clairvoyant was her way of supplementing the income she was making in the boarding house. But that means, of course, you've got the servants in the boarding house, and you have the boarders in the boarding house, and you have their friends. So they become the cast of characters that often bring the mystery to her. So Annie and Nate and her friends are consistent throughout the series in terms of solving whatever mystery is involved. And you know, as a result, you know, it's she goes undercover, her friends go undercover, or they happen to be working in employment. I haven't quite decided, you know, who's going to go into the department store at this point of my characters to you know, to look at whatever the crime is. But yes, absolutely a consistent cast of characters.
Okay. And when you set down to start a new book in the series, so of course you've got a larger story that these all fit inside, but do you begin with your character? Do you begin with your setting? Of course, each one of these focuses on a different profession, but how do you start to craft your story? Do you where does it begin, and what's your process like for laying out your pre-production, so to speak?
I think as I do my research, I start to think about potential mystery plots, right? And so when I start to outline, by that time I usually have a basic idea of, you know, who's going to die or what crime is going to be committed and who did it. And then I also have a character arc because, as I said, there's a romantic as well as personal development. My characters, you know, start off flawed and they have, you know, obstacles that they need to overcome. And so since the story goes through, you know, several books, I'll think, okay, in this particular book, you know, what are the obstacles to Annie and Nate's developing relationship, or what new character am I going to bring in that's going to change the dynamic? So I have the basic mystery plot and the basic character arc, and then I, you know, start to develop the outline thinking about where would this be a good scene to, you know, if I'm going to have a argument between the two main characters, let's put the argument in a particular venue in San Francisco that will permit me to, you know, move around the city. So that sort of then comes third in terms of thinking about how to bring in the historical background.
Awesome.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Do you have a set number of books that you predict this storyline will go, or are you just going to go until you've exhausted the characters?
You know, sometimes what I'll say is at some point I'm really going to want to retire. I mean, this was supposed to be retirement.
Right.
And I'm working 24/7, which I'm loving because it's all stuff that I'm choosing to do. You know, it's not just the writing. I'm very active in something called the Historical Fiction Authors Cooperative. There's 47 of us who are all writing historical fiction, and I'm one of the, you know, on the board of directors, and so I spend a lot of time on that organization. The new organization that we'll hopefully talk about in a few minutes about the science fiction organization is I'm also very active in. So, you know, I mean, I'm 65, and so sometimes what I think is, well, maybe when I'm 80, I'll get too tired to do this.
But there'll be one more story to tell.
Right, exactly. So, you know, there is a degree to which, you know, I can write as fast or as slow. You know, I can look at a week and say, well, I didn't get much writing this week because I went out to lunch with friends several times, and that's okay.
Right. Because
theoretically, I'm in retirement. So I will continue to do it as long as it's fun.
That's a great answer. And speaking of working 24/7, and I think that's a great segue, you're involved in this new project, the DC Chronicles. Is it DC?
Yes,
okay.
I think so.
Yeah.
That's how I've been saying it in my mind.
Well, that's how I said it the first time I saw it too. So, tell us about this. This seems to be a complete 180 from your San Francisco stories. What is this new thing? And it seems to me to be revolutionary. What's going on with it?
Okay, the history of this. Well, okay, it's not a complete turnaround for me in that besides mysteries, the other recreational reading that was always my favorite was science fiction. So as a reader, I've always enjoyed the world building that goes on with both historical fiction and science fiction. I think that's one of the key things that they have in common is creating worlds other than our contemporary world. So,
right.
But what happened was a group of authors who came together on a Facebook site just to sort of talk about marketing. One of those authors read a post by Hugh Howey, who, of course, among indies is, the rock star of particularly in science fiction, of being an indie author who was not only successful but incredibly generous in terms of giving back to other authors. And he'd written a post sort of essentially challenging publishers of the kind of things that they ought to do. And one of the things he said was that what publishers ought to do is instead of waiting for, some author who's created a universe that is so rich that people want to write, sort of fan fiction in it, that he should bring together, maybe 12 authors to write in a shared world and create that world. And of course, our reaction as indies was, why should we wait for a publisher to do that? So this discussion happened in July a year ago on a Facebook page. And at the end of about, 45 comments on that string, a number of us had said, well, let's do that. Let's create a world, a science fiction world, that we will collaborate. We will make open source. So any author who wants to write in it can write in it, publish it. They keep their royalties. They can go to a traditional, publisher if they want, or do it indie. And on one hand, I was just in the process of starting to write the fourth book. So what I committed to was writing a short story in this world.
Okay.
But over the next year, I became one of the main ones creating the world. I, in fact, sort of after brainstorming with other authors, wrote the backstory for the world. And the more research I did and the more creating of the world, the more invested I got into it. So when I finished Deadly Proof in February, I immediately sat down and started writing the short story that became an 85,000-word full-length novel.
That's never happened to me. Yeah.
No.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The story just took over, didn't it?
Yes, it absolutely did. And of course, it's now the first of a series.
Nice. Now, the world is open source. Therefore, you've got a collection of world documents and standards for the world, and all of. Tell me if I'm understanding this right.
Yes. In fact, what for your listeners, if they haven't heard of, Amazon as part of its innovation did something called Kindle Worlds, and what they essentially did was, really monetize fan fiction, because for years people have been writing fiction set in other people's creative worlds, but they haven't been able to sell them because they didn't have the rights. So what Amazon did was say, well, let's make an agreement between, the creator of this world and the people who want to write in the world, and we'll all get a piece of the action. So we used that as a model. The only difference is we weren't going to claim, we were going to keep our rights to anything we wrote, but we weren't going to shut the door to anybody else or, say that they needed to pay us anything. And I think this really comes out of, there's an incredible sense of collaboration that I find among indie authors that is difficult for traditional authors, because they have agents they have to please and publishers they have to please, and there's a sort of competitive nature to, if my book does well, it means your book isn't going to do as well. And I just don't find that as much with indies. So the idea of creating something and then getting enjoyment out of the fact that somebody else is going to, write about that world, and some other reader was going to discover it because they happen to like that author, is very exciting to me. So At this point, there are 7 of us, including my daughter, and this has been one of the most fun things about this. My daughter's, got a large family to take care of and very busy, but she's, been writing, not publishing, and so she's one of the authors, and she's written a short story that we essentially collaborated on, which means that I brainstorm and she writes and then I edit. So there's 7 of us, and 2 of us have written full-length novels, and then my daughter wrote the short story, and then the other authors have written novellas that are going to be parts of series. And the books are up. Most of them are up for pre-order at this point, and then we're going to launch them all together on September 1st. But what's been very exciting is that we sort of hoped that other authors, once we published, would find the world and be interested in the world and writing in it. But that has all been enormously accelerated because we got hooked up with a group called the Future Chronicles.
Sam Peralta's group.
Right. And how that happened was serendipitous. Cherie Lasota, who was the person who's created our website and been one of the major participants in the DC Chronicles, wrote Hugh Howey a couple of days before we did sort of our general cover reveal as the beginning of a soft launch of books, to let him know that he'd inspired us and, let him know that we were quoting him and hoping, of course, that he would go over and look at our website and find it interesting. Well, not only did he do that, but he shared it on Facebook, and Sam Peralta jumped on it. And I'd never heard of the Future Chronicles. What it is a group of 300-plus science fiction fantasy authors. I'm assuming, from what I've seen, mostly indie authors.
Right.
Who have been putting out anthologies of short stories set around a theme, so that they'll put out a call saying, we want short stories about artificial intelligence, or we want short stories about dragons, or we want short stories about, psychic abilities, or et cetera. But what Sam recognized was, in our collaborative world, that we could put out a call for short stories set in our world that he would then produce the way he had been producing these anthologies, these Future Chronicles anthologies. And so within about 24 hours, he had put out a call for what now he's essentially calling Chronicle Worlds, and now, in addition to the Chronicle Worlds Paradisi, there's 2 other Chronicle Worlds that have been created. One around Anthea Sharp, who has a fantasy series quite successful, and she has jumped on board and said, okay, I'm going to create a Bible and open up my world to other authors who want to write short stories, and submit them for these anthologies. And then I guess there was a sort of prototype to what we did called Drifting Isles, which was a steampunk world that 3 books had been written in, and they had wanted to make it available, but it didn't look like people had really pursued that, and so they're opening that back up for short story writers. And at this point, I've been contacted by 24 science fiction authors who've wanted me to give them access to our Bible because they're interested in, thinking about submitting a short story or looking into whether this is a world they want to write, maybe a full-length book in. So, within a week, suddenly we have all this interest, and most of them seem to be well-published indie authors who, have series of their own. So I'm just very excited.
Yeah, it's you're absolutely right. Over the last week or two, there's just been this enormous buzz through the indie author community. It's just paradises everywhere, and I hope you have tremendous success with it. It's a really revolutionary thing to just open up a world, create it, and give people unfettered access to it. Well, are there rules? Like how do you maintain something this big? How do you maintain order and prevent the story from going places that you would rather it not go?
Okay. This has personally been very interesting for me. It's been a good lesson in letting go. Because one of the things that, in this year of creating the backstory, and then as all of us started to write our own stories, we would get together and somebody would say, does anybody have any difficulty if I introduce this? And people would add to the Bible, because, for example, in this world, there's a group who have psychic abilities. And so, working out exactly what that means, each of us are sort of doing slightly differently. And, I have a lot invested both in how I'm treating the world in my own book, as well as the fact that I help sort of create a lot of the backstory. So part of what I've had to learn is if I'm going to make this truly open source, I can't dictate exactly what everybody else is going to write. So, so part of it has been a recognition that we cannot control everything if we're going to make it truly open source. What we have done, however, is say that if you want to eventually be an author that we will promote, that we will make you part of the website, and you will have an author page, and your books will be promoted on our website, and we will list your books in our books as, see other books in the DC Chronicles, then you have to be vetted. And so you can write whatever you want, but if you want to, get our banner and get on our website and have us promote you, then there has to be certain standard in terms of the quality of the book production, formatting, and writing, and cover design, and you have to have, not strayed too far from the Bible, so that it's recognizably in this world, and you haven't introduced, a complete new wrinkle to the timeline that, throws everybody else's books out of whack. And we've also said that if you want to use a main character that has been created by another author, you have to ask for their permission. And then we get to decide for each of our books what we consider the main characters. How this is going to work, time will tell. I'm very pleased at the quality of the authors who've expressed interest, because I think they're professionals and will do a good job. And already we have a closed Facebook site for those authors that, so that they can ask us questions. And since many of them have more science fiction and more science backgrounds than we do, we've now been able to ask questions of them, and get feedback that I think is going to help improve our writing. Will there be stuff out there that I might read in the future and cringe and go, oh, probably.
Yeah.
But my experience is if there's a market for it and people want to buy it, well, then that's their right. And if it's really bad, then probably people won't buy it and it'll sink into obscurity. So I shouldn't worry about it.
Yeah. The market helps to filter out a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
So that's great. I really look forward to seeing where it's going. September 1st, is that kind of your big launch?
Yeah, September 1st is when the first sort of 7 works will come out, and then right now the anthology date, I think, for everybody to submit, and what will happen is people will submit their short stories first to us as the core Paradisi group, and then if we feel, yes, this is something that, we're happy to be under our name, it will then go on to Sam, and he'll do his sort of usual process in terms of choosing which will go in. And I'm hoping there'll be enough so that there'll be several anthologies. And so that probably won't come out until, I think the deadline is the end of November, and so I don't know how quickly he gets books out once the deadline is reached. And certainly a number of our authors are immediately going on and, writing the next novella in their series. And I will probably shift gears and start to work on my next historical. But what I'm hoping is that I will start to do what I think some of the most successful indies do, which is have more than one series, and you put one book out in one series, and then while that's sort of being read and, by beta readers and edited and then, finding its market, I'll be busy writing in the science fiction world. And then when that book comes out, then I'll switch. So I really think it's going to up my productivity because it will keep me writing. Because I noticed what would happen is that there's 6 or 7 months where I did research, then when I started writing again, I was just slow.
Yeah.
And this time, because I started writing the science fiction right after I finished writing the historical, my productivity was much higher. I put this draft was 6 months from beginning to end, which is a lot shorter than the 2 years I had been doing. So.
And that's a great practice for writers in general to kind of shift gears and write a palate cleanser, so to speak, to get your mind working on something else. And I know from my experience when I do that, when I come back to that other project, the creativity is just flowing because I've allowed myself to focus on something else. That's I think that's a great productivity tip in general for writers.
Yes, absolutely. I think it keeps you writing and it keeps you fresh. And you're right. There's a certain staleness when you've finished a book that going away. And of course, one of the things about the science fiction is that it's really stretching my mind. I mean, the historical stuff comes pretty easy because I spent my entire career with that. But I'm, reading these magazines about, M drives and wormhole technology and, anti-gravity matter and stuff, which is keeping me very young and keeping my brain nimble. But I think what it also means is that now that I'm starting to shift back and think about the historical stuff, it's like, ooh, it's like a nice, comfortable pair of slippers. I can't wait to get back.
Well, Louisa Locke, it seems that your retirement has gotten infinitely more busy lately.
Yes.
Where can people connect with you online to to collect your already published books or to get plugged into Paradisi and to just follow you along your journey?
Okay, basically my website is your usual HTTP or www, M Louisa Locke, so MLouisaLocké.com. And that's pretty much for Twitter or for Facebook. I have a Facebook author page, which is, M Louisa Locke author. And on my website, there is a link to the DC Chronicles, which is also just paradisichronicles.com. So if somebody's particularly interested in that, getting to my website will get you both to all my historical work, but it will also get you to DC Chronicles. So that's probably the best place to start.
Excellent. And I'll put a link to your website and your stuff in the show notes, and we'll send everyone over to get a free copy of your first book in the Victorian San Francisco
Right, absolutely.
Mysteries. Doesn't
cost you a thing to give it a try, and if you like it, there's more, and if you don't, then you move on to the next book.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure that people will love it. I'm going to start reading it and get my daughters reading it as well, and I can't wait to see what comes out of Paradisi. So we'll follow up with you later and give an update after those books launch in
That
September.
would be lovely. That would be lovely.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you for taking time on your Saturday to join me.
Thank you so much for the interview. It was fun.